I parked my car in the lot just as the early evening light cast long shadows across Fredericksburg's familiar streets. The American Legion Hall loomed ahead, its brick facade washed in the golden glow of lamps. I hesitated for a moment, letting the memories of countless family gatherings and disappointments weigh on me. Aunt June, always the one who saw the finer side of things, had insisted I come. She was already inside, smiling and waving, her hand beckoning me forward with quiet encouragement. I straightened my back, adjusted the strap of my purse, and stepped onto the uneven concrete walkway. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and faint country tunes floated through the partially open doors. Folding chairs lined the hall in neat rows, tables draped in plastic cloths held platters of food and scattered napkins. Guests chatted in small clusters, occasionally glancing toward the entry, and I noticed immediately who acknowledged me with a polite nod and who looked away, avoiding my eyes. The air smelled faintly of fried chicken and coleslaw, mingling with the scent of polished wood and vinyl tablecloths. I took it all in, cataloging every glance, every whisper, every subtle signal of tension hidden beneath smiles. I moved through the crowd slowly, keeping my eyes alert. The whispers were almost imperceptible but persistent, snippets of gossip floating through the air like smoke. "She's here, can you believe it?" And, "I heard she's still single." I clenched my jaw and forced myself to smile politely when someone passed, masking the surge of emotions threatening to spill over. My father had been late, as usual, and I knew exactly how he would act the moment he had everyone's attention. I found Aunt June by the refreshments table. Her hand on my shoulder was steady, grounding me. "You look beautiful," she said quietly, "don't let him ruin tonight for you." Her words offered a small reprieve, though I could feel the old familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I took a deep breath, letting the ambient music wash over me, trying to focus on the task at hand, survive the evening with dignity. Then it happened. My father stepped up, a drink in hand, clearing his throat for attention. The murmurs quieted instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice loud and rehearsed, "we're here to celebrate my son, the real heir to the family." I froze. My gaze followed him, catching the gleam in his eyes that always preceded a wound. "And of course, we must acknowledge my daughter," he continued, pausing for effect, "though we all know she's never really belonged here." He punctuated his insult with a sarcastic smile and a raise of the glass, and the word, "bastard," slipped out before he caught himself. The room went silent, save for the subtle clatter of a fork hitting a plate and the soft hum of whispers. I felt the heat rush to my face, the sting of humiliation slicing deeper than any physical blow. I remained seated, fists clenched under the table, forcing every muscle to stay still. Memories of childhood neglect flickered before me, birthdays forgotten, achievements overlooked, the endless parade of favoritism for everyone else. I swallowed hard, refusing to let the room witness my fury. My father's gaze scanned the crowd, seeking validation, and I could see the faint glances exchanged among guests, some horrified, some amused. I kept my lips pressed together, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The moment my father embraced the new son, lavishing praise and attention on him, I felt a surge of simmering resentment. Here was a young man, unaware of the storm he had walked into, basking in the approval that had been denied me my entire life. I noted the contrast sharply, my career accomplishments, my disciplined military service, the personal victories quietly amassed over decades, ignored entirely in favor of this newcomer. I measured my patience, weighing the wisdom in staying composed against the urge to confront him immediately. My mind worked through strategies, contemplating the moral high ground, the optics, the timing. Every detail mattered. The angle of the lights reflecting off the polished floor, the faint scent of perfume from a guest brushing past, the shifting postures of family members who had once been allies. I recognized the necessity of restraint. A calculated calm, a silent strength, would be far more powerful than any outburst. Eventually, I rose under the guise of needing air and stepped outside, the cool evening wrapping around me like a protective cloak. The distant sounds of conversation and clinking glasses were softened by the thick walls of the hall. I leaned against my car, letting my mind run through the litany of past injustices and triumphs. My military service, the campaigns endured, the discipline drilled into me, these were my invisible armor, my reminders that silence could carry the weight of authority. I breathed deeply, the scent of asphalt and pine grounding me. In that moment, I recalled my mother's oft-repeated advice: fight clean, fight with precision, never descend into the chaos of the other side. My eyes wandered to small, seemingly trivial details: a folded napkin left askew, a glass half full, a subtle glance from Aunt June across the room. These minutiae reminded me that observation was power. Every slight, every reaction, every whisper of attention given or withheld became a puzzle piece for the strategy forming quietly in my mind. The thought of returning inside flickered through my consciousness. Perhaps it was time to let them see the full measure of who I was, beyond the shallow judgments of a father who had long misunderstood me. My hand brushed over the garment bag resting in the back seat, where my blue dress uniform lay neatly folded. Its crisp lines and polished metals carried a story of service, discipline, and resilience that no insult could diminish. A subtle smirk crossed my face as I imagined the moment of revelation, the quiet shift of power when truth would finally meet perception. The evening air felt electric, charged with potential. I inhaled deeply, contemplating whether to confront the humiliation head-on or wait for the precise, calculated moment when all eyes would witness the reality I carried with me, an unspoken authority that had been forged over years of endurance. The tension lingered, suspended between patience and action, anticipation thick as the fading light stretched across the parking lot. I leaned back against the far corner of the Legion Hall, my eyes tracing the movement of guests who had begun to settle into their seats. The warm glow of the overhead lights gave everything a soft, almost nostalgic sheen, but it did nothing to soften the tension I felt coiling in my chest. The music had shifted to a slow country ballad, the kind that encourages reflection, and I let it wash over me as I scanned the room. Every smile, every nod, every whispered exchange was noted. I catalogued allies, neutrals, and those who would inevitably side with my father, the subtle dynamics of attention and avoidance mapping themselves in my mind. A faint twinge of anger simmered beneath my calm exterior, but I reminded myself, patience had always been my advantage. In countless past situations, restraint had turned the tide more effectively than confrontation. I silently rehearsed the mantra I carried from my youth: observe, calculate, act at the right moment. Across the room, my father hovered near the center table, the new son at his side. I watched him, not with envy but with analytical precision. Every small gesture, the way he straightened his stepbrother's tie, the slight emphasis on certain phrases, the subtle claps on the shoulder, revealed the favoritism that had been a constant in my life. The stepbrother, unaware of my presence beyond polite nods, responded with a mix of admiration and awe. It was almost endearing if not for the knowledge that he stood in a place I had earned through years of discipline and service. I studied his micro-expressions, the raised brow, the hesitant smile, the quick glance toward my father for validation. He wanted approval, and my father, ever the manipulative orchestrator, gave it freely. I recognized patterns I had memorized in childhood, patterns of control, hierarchy, and the subtle reinforcement of loyalty through praise. My thoughts drifted inward, measuring the distance between recognition and reality. Every accomplishment I had earned, professional accolades, military service, personal victories, had been overlooked in favor of appearances and superficial affection. I rehearsed in my mind how future moves might unfold: when to speak, when to remain silent, when to let subtle displays of authority ripple through the room without a word. Memories of past neglect emerged like ghosts, each one reinforcing the importance of calculated action over impulsive reaction. I could almost see a chessboard stretched across the hall, pieces arranged, moves plotted with deliberate intent. The key was timing. I would not act until every advantage was aligned. Aunt June approached quietly, her eyes scanning the room before settling on mine. Her subtle nod, the slight tilt of her head, communicated everything without a word. She had always been a master of discreet guidance, teaching me that influence could be exercised without grand gestures. We exchanged a few low words, observing the reactions of nearby guests to minor comments she let slip, and I watched how attention shifted, how perceptions altered ever so slightly. Each movement, each phrase, became a tool, and I catalogued them carefully, storing them for when the right moment presented itself. The quiet amusement I felt was tempered by a sense of empowerment. Here, in the midst of subtle chaos, I retained control of my own narrative. The evening stretched, the murmur of conversations mingling with the music, and I allowed myself a measured breath, tracing the embroidery on my service ribbons beneath the folds of my jacket. The shine of each ribbon, each medal, carried stories of endurance and quiet authority. I imagined how their presence might draw glances, provoke recognition, shift energy in the room subtly but irrevocably. Patience, I reminded myself, was a weapon as sharp as any confrontation. My father might see the surface, the polite exterior, but I knew the weight of what I carried. Every calculated observation, every unspoken measure of power, was a step toward reclaiming the respect that had been denied me. The anticipation hummed, a quiet tension that promised change without a single word. Tonight, the first move was observation, the next would be assertion, precise and undeniable. I had taken a seat near the back, though close enough to catch every shift in posture, every sideways glance. The Legion Hall felt smaller now, its warmth intensified by the closer proximity of the guests and the subtle orchestration of social dynamics. Conversations moved in murmurs, punctuated by the clink of silverware and the occasional soft laughter, all blending into a current I had learned to navigate over decades. I noticed alliances forming almost imperceptibly, nods shared between distant cousins, whispered reassurances from friends of my father, tiny gestures meant to reinforce the hierarchy he so meticulously maintained. My pulse quickened, not from surprise, but from the recognition of patterns I knew all too well. Quietly, I catalogued each movement, mentally marking which individuals might be swayed, which might betray, and which would be useful when the time came. It wasn't long before I overheard the subtle betrayal. A family friend, leaning a little too close to the table, commented in a hushed tone about some minor misstep I had made years ago, framing it as evidence that my father's indifference was justified. I caught the way another guest laughed lightly at the remark, not maliciously, but in alignment with an unspoken loyalty to him. It was small, almost trivial, yet the significance was clear. This was part of a broader strategy to undermine my presence and deny me recognition. The weight of it settled heavily, but I felt no rash urge to respond. Instead, I stored each word, each gesture, as ammunition for future leverage, my mind weaving a map of influence, of opportunity, of subtle counter-moves that could shift the balance without anyone noticing. Flashbacks rose unbidden. I saw my teenage self navigating similar currents at family gatherings, learning to listen, to observe, to anticipate. Lessons learned from years of careful patience resurfaced. Timing is everything. One misstep, one overt display, and the carefully constructed edifice of my father's control could collapse, or it could cement my exile further. I considered the leverage points, small victories that might accrue unnoticed, gestures that could unsettle the room just enough to make my presence undeniable. Frustration flickered, but it was tempered by strategic insight. The simmering determination inside me solidified into a plan that required discretion, precision, and patience. I tested reactions cautiously. A remark, casually mentioning a professional achievement, drew a subtle lift of the head from a cousin. Another guest caught my gaze and nodded faintly, acknowledgement without confrontation. My stepbrother, seated nearby, glanced my way, confusion and curiosity mingling across his features. He sensed a quiet influence, even if he could not yet name it. My father, seemingly oblivious, remained focused on socializing with others, unaware that the ground beneath him was subtly shifting. Each measured interaction, each small display of competence or insight, added weight to my silent authority. I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction, knowing that these subtle maneuvers would ripple outward, affecting perception without a single raised voice. By the time the room had settled into a soft murmur of conversation and clinking glasses, I identified a moment that might allow me to assert recognition without direct confrontation. A carefully placed glance, a deliberately mentioned accomplishment, a hint of my military discipline, each calculated to draw attention, to expose the cracks in the carefully maintained hierarchy. I traced the outline of my name on the program, imagining how small gestures could shift energy, how patience could become influence. The tension coiled within me, anticipation mingling with empowerment. The room seemed to hold its breath, unknowingly awaiting the first act of quiet assertion. I would wait, and when the moment arrived, the impact would be undeniable. Every observation, every calculation, brought me closer to reclaiming the respect I had long been denied. I lingered near the side of the hall, my eyes scanning the subtle movements of each guest. The chandeliers cast a dim glow, shadows stretching across the polished floor as laughter and polite chatter intertwined with the soft strains of music. I tracked the shifting alliances, a cousin leaning slightly toward my father, a friend nodding in agreement with a stepbrother's anecdote, whispers exchanged over platters of hors d'oeuvres. Each gesture, each glance, told a story I had learned to read long ago. Patience had been my ally, and tonight I was watching, cataloging, and planning, letting the tension simmer just beneath the surface while maintaining the calm I had cultivated over decades. I began asserting my presence through quiet gestures. A mention of a professional accolade, casually integrated into conversation, drew more attention than I had expected. I noted the subtle reactions. A raised eyebrow from an acquaintance, a glance of mild envy, a fleeting look of recognition that hinted at shifting perceptions. My father, ever vigilant, tried to counteract the attention I was drawing. He smiled, redirected conversation, and leaned toward guests with subtle gestures meant to keep me in the periphery. I observed without confrontation, recognizing the micro-manipulations for what they were, and allowed them to feed my strategic patience. Each small movement I made, each quietly measured word, became a test of loyalty: who could be influenced, who would resist, and who might serve my purposes later. Engaging in light conversation, I probed without revealing my intentions. A simple inquiry about a mutual acquaintance, a carefully placed observation about my career path, these small actions rippled through the room, shifting attention in ways that would become more pronounced in time. My stepbrother, sitting across the hall, started to notice the subtle currents I was influencing. Curiosity flickered in his eyes, and I could tell he was registering my competence, though he didn't yet understand its full extent. I felt a cautious satisfaction, recognizing the seed of respect and awareness taking root. No overt confrontation was necessary. Quiet influence could be far more powerful than any public assertion. My father's maneuvers continued, each small attempt to maintain control over the room's perception noted and countered internally. I recorded patterns, predicting the ebb and flow of his attention, planning how to navigate his subtle redirections. The balance of power felt delicate, but I was growing more confident in my ability to shift it imperceptibly. Even my stepbrother seemed to unconsciously acknowledge my capability, a tiny but meaningful crack in the facade my father had worked so hard to maintain. The sense of impending action built within me, a readiness for the precise moment when subtlety would give way to undeniable presence. As the evening wore on, I identified a pivotal opportunity, a single remark, perfectly timed, that could alter perceptions without triggering resistance. The room hummed with soft conversation and laughter, unaware of the potential shift looming quietly in my plan. I traced the edge of my service ribbons, imagining how a deliberate gesture might redirect attention, awaken an ally, and quietly assert recognition where none had existed before. Anticipation coiled within me, mixing with determination, as I readied myself for the moment when patience and strategy would converge. Tonight, I would test loyalties, measure reactions, and position myself for the subtle yet undeniable impact I had been waiting to make. The evening had settled into a tense rhythm, and I moved through the room with deliberate calm, noting every flicker of attention, every subtle gesture. My father, ever the orchestrator of social hierarchies, continued his quiet manipulation, placing guests where they could reinforce his perceived authority. I observed the angles from which he leaned, the half-smiles he offered selectively, and the way his words could redirect the room's energy with a barely perceptible inflection. My stepbrother remained at the periphery, cautiously attentive, not yet fully understanding the breadth of my quiet influence. Aunt June, stationed nearby, offered subtle nods and whispered hints that reinforced my assessment. Patience, timing, and precision were paramount. I tested small statements, letting them drift naturally into conversations, watching how each was received. A remark about a recent professional milestone earned a quick glance from a cousin who had always been dismissive. A subtle correction of a misstatement about my past achievements caused a minor ripple of acknowledgement, as if the room unconsciously recalibrated their perceptions. My father's attempts to counter these gestures, redirecting conversation, emphasizing his stepchild's accomplishments, gesturing toward a few attentive guests, were noted, catalogued, and met with quiet countermeasures. I made no sudden moves. Each interaction was measured, each reaction observed. The room became a chessboard, and I was calculating my next steps while maintaining a composed exterior. Stepbrother's awareness began to sharpen. In subtle ways, he mirrored attention to my comments, asked questions that drew upon my expertise, and offered small, seemingly unconscious acknowledgments of my authority. Aunt June's discreet guidance confirmed my observations. He was aligning, quietly, in support without the need for a visible declaration. This shift, though subtle, carried weight. Even a minor realignment in social perception could ripple outward, changing how others positioned themselves. I found a quiet satisfaction in seeing patience and strategic planning pay off, reinforcing my resolve to continue navigating the room with control and subtlety. Managing the room's perception required an intricate balance. I monitored responses to ensure that my presence was noticed without provoking overt defensiveness. Humor became a tool, a soft edge that allowed me to correct, redirect, or emphasize points without creating confrontation. A gentle quip about a shared memory drew soft laughter, a reminder that social equilibrium could be influenced without aggression. Every smile, every pause, was carefully calculated. The goal was to assert visibility and authority without undermining my strategic advantage. Even as my father attempted to maintain dominance, I found small victories in nods of recognition, in subtle shifts in seating attention, and in the stepbrother's growing alignment with my quiet authority. As the evening edged further along, I identified a moment ripe for subtle escalation. Timing, as always, was everything. A well-placed observation, delivered when the room's attention was lightly focused elsewhere, could tilt the perception in my favor. The energy in the room was charged with unspoken tension, a network of glances and whispers waiting to acknowledge the shift. I sensed that the moment when silence would no longer suffice was approaching, that a quiet confrontation, strategic, controlled, and undeniable, was at hand. Anticipation coiled within me, and I prepared to seize the opportunity when the room itself would bear witness to the truth of my presence and accomplishments. The private lounge felt smaller than it had any right to be, the dim lighting pressing in, shadows mingling with the faint strains of background music. I could sense my father's heightened awareness, the way his eyes darted toward those whose attention I had subtly drawn. Each glance, each carefully placed word, was a maneuver in his ongoing effort to assert control. He was sharper tonight, more deliberate in his gestures and phrasing, pushing the room's social currents to favor him, but I had anticipated this escalation. I measured my own movements carefully, noting every micro-expression among the guests, every subtle shift in their body language, and every pause pregnant with unspoken opinion. My stepbrother hovered nearby, offering quiet support without yet exposing himself fully to confrontation, and Aunt June lingered at the periphery, her subtle nods a silent guide. The tension between what was said and what remained unspoken coiled in the air, and I felt my pulse tighten, not from fear, but from the heightened alertness that comes with strategy in motion. I began a careful counteraction, each sentence and gesture designed to assert presence without igniting overt conflict. A wry comment about a shared family memory drew appreciative attention, enough to redirect subtle currents of opinion. When my father attempted a veiled barb aimed at minimizing my achievements, I responded with calm precision, a quiet correction accompanied by a measured tone that exposed the weakness in his phrasing without revealing my full hand. Stepbrother's eyes flickered, acknowledging the balance I was reclaiming. His quiet reinforcement provided the silent scaffolding that allowed my subtle maneuvers to gain traction. Each interaction was a calculated step, a delicate dance between assertion and restraint, with every observer a piece on a board I was now controlling more effectively than ever before. The room's social landscape shifted incrementally as I moved. Guests who had previously aligned subtly with my father began to reassess their positions, drawn by my composed authority. Laughter and murmured approval flowed in unexpected directions, and I could see the surprise ripple across my father's face, a micro-expression of unease barely masked behind his practiced smile. Aunt June's discreet nods confirmed my perception. My strategy was working, creating leverage I could exploit when the moment was right. Even as my father attempted minor diversions, reintroducing topics that favored his narratives, complementing stepbrother achievements with pointed timing. My calm persistence countered every subtle nudge. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the internal validation that comes when patience and experience allow one to manipulate the flow of attention without ever raising a voice. When my father launched a more provocative statement, aiming to test boundaries, I neutralized it effortlessly. A casual anecdote, paired with a calm, steady gaze, rendered the remark impotent in its intent. The guest's reactions confirmed my advantage: murmurs of surprise, subtle glances that acknowledged the shift in dynamics, and the faint tilt of stepbrother's respect. The lounge, once a stage for my father's dominance, was quietly transforming under the influence of composure and strategy. Each micro-victory built upon the last, and with every subtle counter, I strengthened my internal sense of empowerment, the knowledge that patience, timing, and precise observation could overturn long-standing patterns of manipulation. As the evening drew on, I recognized the exact moment when my private victories could evolve into public acknowledgement. The tension was palpable, a current that hummed through the room as I prepared to make a move that would not only assert my presence but recalibrate the balance of authority. The stage was set for a significant shift. The room itself was ready to witness that silence was no longer an option. I could feel the anticipation coiling, my own controlled excitement tempered by experience and restraint. Each detail mattered: the cadence of my speech, the subtle gestures, the gaze that swept the room to anchor attention. Power, I realized, was not seized with force but with awareness, patience, and the quiet assurance that comes from knowing exactly when to act. The study was quieter than I expected, the kind of quiet that makes every subtle sound, a drawer closing, a whispered laugh from the hall, feel amplified. I perched near the window, where the faint streetlight traced thin shadows across the polished floor, and reviewed every maneuver, every slight humiliation my father had orchestrated over the years. I could feel his presence even before he entered, the weight of expectation and the unspoken authority he carried, but tonight the scales felt different. Stepbrother lingered near the doorway, eyes alert, offering discreet pieces of information, a nod here, a subtle gesture there, but he knew not to reveal himself fully. Aunt June moved softly among the shadows, hinting at cues I might otherwise miss, reinforcing patterns I had long memorized. Everything I had endured, every slight and sneer, now became a map of opportunity. My pulse held steady, anticipation mixed with a calculated calm as I mentally prepared for the unfolding strategy that would change the dynamic in ways he couldn't yet perceive. I watched my father engage a small cluster of guests, each comment and smile measured, the edges of control visible in micro-expressions and fleeting gestures. He was overconfident, underestimating the full scope of what I had learned, the silent intelligence I wielded like a quiet weapon. I identified the vulnerabilities, small inconsistencies in his narrative, subtle insecurities he tried to mask behind bravado. Stepbrother, attentive and cautious, reinforced my insights, alerting me to the faintest cues that indicated a shift in mood or attention. Aunt June's discreet gestures reminded me of past lessons: timing, patience, and subtle leverage. I began to thread my presence into the room, small acknowledgments, well-placed comments, the quiet display of my experience and competence without the need for loud assertion. Every interaction felt like chess, each move measured, every observer a pawn to be influenced without the pawn realizing it. The first leverage point appeared when my father inadvertently revealed a small flaw, a crack in his polished veneer. It was subtle, a hesitation, a word misused, a glance that betrayed tension, but it was enough. I allowed the moment to settle, letting the observation sink into my awareness, and began positioning my responses to exploit it. The room's dynamics shifted imperceptibly at first, but perceptibly for those paying attention. Guests who had unconsciously aligned with my father's dominance glanced toward me, curiosity piqued by my measured presence. Stepbrother caught my eye and nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement that the balance was beginning to tip. Even Aunt June allowed herself the faintest smile, a confirmation that my strategy was proceeding as intended. My confidence grew quietly, the tension coiled, an unseen spring ready to release. I began implementing the strategy with precision, subtle gestures and pointed remarks woven seamlessly into casual conversation. I referenced accomplishments with humility yet undeniable clarity, shared anecdotes that showcased my experience without seeming self-serving. Each delivery drew attention, shifted perception, and subtly undermined the authority my father assumed without noticing. His attempts to redirect the flow or reassert control faltered, met with calm retorts that neither escalated nor diminished my composure. Stepbrother moved more freely now, quietly reinforcing my position without overt action. Guests sensed the change even if they couldn't articulate it, their whispers carrying a tension of anticipation as the social hierarchy silently recalibrated. By the time the evening deepened, the stage was set. I could see it in the slight tension in my father's shoulders, the micro pauses in his speech, the subtle glances he cast toward others, measuring the shifts he could not yet fully account for. The psychological edge was mine, gained through observation, patience, and strategic implementation. Each small victory felt deliberate, a reinforcement of the quiet authority I wielded. I prepared for the decisive moments to come, for the transition from subtle influence to overt acknowledgement. The balance of power was nearing its tipping point, and silence, once my shield, would soon give way to the assertion of truth. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, the anticipation tangible as I readied the final moves of a carefully constructed strategy that would leave no doubt about who truly commanded attention and respect. The ballroom was alive with muted conversations, the glint of crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished wood floors, yet beneath the polite chatter there was an undercurrent of tension I could feel in every step and sideways glance. I stood near the head table, poised, each movement calculated, eyes tracing the subtle shifts in my father's posture. Stepbrother lingered just behind, his quiet nods guiding me without drawing attention. Aunt June remained on the periphery, her subtle gestures a silent reassurance that the timing was right. Guests sensed the electric pause before action, the small silences and shared glances signaling something significant was about to unfold. I held the evidence carefully, the culmination of years of patience, observation, and strategic planning, knowing that every second would count. My pulse was steady, the familiar weight of controlled anticipation pressing against my chest, but beneath it was a simmering thrill. This was the moment I had prepared for. I began with a subtle gesture, sliding the documents across the polished surface to a spot where everyone could see without suspecting the gravity. The crowd's murmur shifted into a stifled hush, curiosity peaked. My father's eyes flickered toward me, disbelief hidden behind a practiced smile, but the cracks were showing. I didn't need to raise my voice. The clarity of the facts spoke louder than any argument he could muster. Each page revealed long hidden manipulations, humiliations carefully orchestrated to undermine me over the years. Guests leaned in, murmurs of recognition and shock rippling through the crowd. Stepbrother stepped forward with corroborating evidence, subtle but undeniable, confirming financial discrepancies and patterns of favoritism that could no longer be denied. The reactions were immediate. Raised eyebrows, whispered disbelief, and the quiet shift of attention from him to me. As the layers of exposure unfolded, the social balance tilted decisively. I watched my father fumble through denials, his composure slipping with each piece of undeniable evidence laid before the room. The tension in the air was thick, every guest attuned to the shift. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with his escalating agitation. I allowed moments to linger, letting the room absorb each revelation, each undeniable truth. Aunt June's quiet presence reinforced the moral weight of the exposure, her subtle affirmations a reminder that justice, when patiently pursued, could be revealed without dramatics. Stepbrother's measured support, small acknowledgments, confirmations, amplified the credibility of what I presented. I felt the satisfaction of strategic victory coursing through me, tempered by the awareness that the moment was still fragile. Guests began to react openly, some with empathy, others with astonishment, all acknowledging the shift. My father's attempts to regain control were futile. His credibility crumbled in the face of clarity, his previous assertions now hollow. I stood with deliberate composure, every gesture calculated to project intelligence, poise, and authority. The room's energy was electric, the previously invisible currents of influence now visible, with me clearly at the center. Each silent glance, each measured pause, contributed to the weight of truth that could no longer be denied. The humiliation that had once been mine, quietly endured, was now turned into the undeniable exposure of deception and manipulation, witnessed by all. There was a strange, satisfying justice in the quiet unfolding of facts, in the intellectual triumph over years of silent undermining. By the time the final documents were laid bare, the atmosphere had transformed. My father's attempts to speak were interrupted by the murmured confirmations from those around, the ripple of recognition unstoppable. I had maintained control, my voice calm, my presence commanding, allowing the evidence itself to deliver the climactic judgment. Stepbrother's subtle support and Aunt June's guiding presence had been critical, reinforcing the truth without confrontation. As I observed the room absorbing the final revelation, I felt the full weight of empowerment, a validation not just of my intelligence, but of patience, strategy, and moral clarity. The silence that followed carried its own resonance, a quiet acknowledgement that power had shifted, that deception had been unmasked, and that the consequences would ripple beyond this gathering. The final reckoning was close, and nothing would be the same again. The garden was bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon sunlight, a gentle contrast to the storm that had swept through the family earlier. I lingered near the rose bushes, observing the subtle reactions of relatives and guests who had witnessed the unraveling of years of deception. My father's face reflected a mixture of regret and stubborn defensiveness, the weight of accountability settling slowly on his shoulders. Stepbrother stayed close, his quiet presence a reminder that alliances forged in patience could withstand even the most delicate aftermath. Aunt June moved among the small groups, offering her measured insights with soft-spoken wisdom, guiding conversations toward understanding without forcing resolution. The air was calmer now, though not free from the echoes of past tensions. I could feel the lingering hesitations, the cautious reassessments of relationships, and the tentative acknowledgement that change had begun. The garden, serene and orderly, seemed to mirror the careful balance I sought within the family: acknowledgement, reflection, and a chance for measured healing. I found a quiet spot and allowed myself a moment to reflect, tracing the mental map of past betrayals, humiliations, and strategic maneuvers. Each memory, sharp, bitter, and formative, now felt filtered through the lens of learned patience and measured intelligence. The years of silent endurance had shaped me, teaching resilience and the art of subtle influence. I thought of my father's patterns, once so imposing, now quietly diminished in the light of clarity and truth. Stepbrother's supportive glances reminded me that the struggle had not been solitary. Even cautious allies could amplify the effects of strategy and integrity. Aunt June's quiet nods and gentle remarks reinforced the moral foundation I had leaned upon: justice, empathy, and the capacity to act decisively without losing one's composure. There was a bittersweet satisfaction in the recognition that personal growth had emerged from confrontation, that empowerment was forged not through rage but through clarity and patience. Conversations with my father were tentative, careful probes into acknowledgement without forcing full reconciliation. He admitted to oversights, to actions that had caused harm, though his words were laced with the residual pride that had long defined him. I listened, maintaining composure, allowing recognition without surrendering authority. Aunt June's counsel reminded me that healing was rarely complete, that accountability sometimes required subtle observation rather than overt confrontation. Some family members expressed empathy, others remained distant, caught between shock and reflection. The room was quiet, punctuated by soft exchanges that signaled shifting dynamics. Even in partial resolution, there was a sense that the family's moral compass was slowly realigning, that lessons had been learned through direct experience rather than lectures. Looking forward, I considered the paths ahead: personal ambitions long deferred, relationships that could be nurtured carefully, and the preservation of legacy and dignity. The clarity gained through this period of upheaval had instilled confidence not only in my abilities but in the principles guiding my actions. Stepbrother's quiet presence continued to reinforce the idea that support could be subtle yet meaningful. Plans for the future were forming, rooted in the understanding that independence and strategic foresight were as essential as family bonds. I felt hope and empowerment coexisting with vigilance, knowing that the scars of the past informed the wisdom needed to navigate what lay ahead. The garden around me, lush and resilient, reflected the potential for growth, renewal, and steady progress. As evening settled and the warm light faded, a calm descended over the estate. The family, having absorbed the revelations and witnessed the consequences, moved through tentative conversations, laughter tinged with new understanding. I held in my mind the symbolic echoes of past events, small tokens that had once represented humiliation now transformed into markers of resilience. There was a subtle hint, whispered among some guests, that my father's accountability might extend beyond the home, socially, morally, even legally. But more importantly, I felt a quiet empowerment, the strength gained from endurance and strategy, ready to meet future challenges without hesitation. The past had been confronted, truths revealed, and while not every wound had fully healed, a foundation for future growth and measured justice had been laid. I walked slowly through the garden, the cool evening breeze carrying the promise of new beginnings, fully aware that the journey ahead was shaped by the lessons of yesterday yet illuminated by the confidence of today.